I'm Jonas, everyone. I'm a PhD student at MIT, and I broadly speaking work on machine learning, deep learning, statistics, and the intersection of these topics. And so just a high-level overview of some of the sort of fundamental goals that you might have in data analysis are either you're trying to understand some insights about some underlying population of interest, and in this case you have a lot of classical statistical work on parametric models where you try and encode sort of all your assumptions and knowledge of the underlying processes of interest. And these crucially rely on strong assumptions and therefore might not be as useful for exploratory analyses. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have sort of non-parametric machine learning methods that are black box, and they might sort of model the underlying population very accurately, but it's hard to draw insights from them. And so a lot of the work I've been doing on the more statistical front is sort of merging both non-parametric and interpretability into one framework through the lens of optimal transport, and using this to model populations in biological contexts, mainly single-cell populations. But today I'm going to talk about actually another sort of broad goal you have when you do data analysis, is to just find actions or changes you can make that will improve outcomes. And here the interest is not so much in interpreting things or understanding the underlying processes, but rather just suggesting some changes that will make the outcomes better that you're interested in. And so the main thing I'm going to argue today is that this requires really careful treatment of uncertainty when you're in a limited data setting rather than sort of a sequential experimentation framework. And so some of the applications you might consider are recommending sort of adjustments for people to improve their well-being, whether it be health or user experience on some website. You could recommend what genes should be manipulated within a cell population or bacteria population to induce some desired change in the behavior of that group. You might have some text that you want to revise to improve some associated outcome that depends on the text, for example, the popularity of a news article. You might want to develop antibodies or proteins that have some specific function and design these based on some limited data set that some scientists collected for you. And more broadly, there's just this massive trend towards using machine learning to find interventions sort of automatically across science, economics, and lots of fields, rather than sort of fitting a statistical model, finding what's statistically significant, and then sort of a human analyst deciding on interventions. Sort of, there's been a big shift towards just machine learning systems that identify good actions to take automatically. And so the classical framework for this is either reinforcement learning, Bayesian optimization, bandit optimization, sequential design. But basically the idea is you iterate between modeling and experimentation, and you kind of try out all the actions. Wherever you're sort of uncertain about what the effect of an action will be, you try that action out until you're kind of confident that it either does work or doesn't work well. It's known as the exploration-exploitation trade-off. The problem is, for example, here on the right, we show this figure of this deep Q network, all the latest and greatest variants of it, and you just see the sample complexity of these methods is humongous. You need so many samples to get things working well, and you really sort of, in a non-digital environment, can't possibly get so many samples. And also, just when you're collaborating with, say, a scientist or a domain expert, it's often much more common they just collect some data, they have the data, and they give it to you, and then you come up with some system based on that single data set. The problem with that, of course, is that you have this fixed single data set. You're always going to have high uncertainty about certain things, and you have to be cognizant of that. And so, just in practical applications, this uncertainty is very crucial to model and consider. For example, self-driving cars, computational pathology are obvious examples where you really need to make sure that you have a measure of how uncertain your systems are. But more in sort of social sciences or human-facing systems, Google had this photo tagging system that tagged African-American people as gorillas, and actually their only fix for this has been to just remove sort of all primate tags as tags. They just no longer are options for the tagging system. But clearly this is an example of selection bias in the training data, and that's sort of another key issue, is that you're never sure that your training data is going to be representative of the test situations you will encounter in all environments. Self-driving car might be trained in Los Angeles, and then it has to drive in Canada somewhere in the snow and it just never encountered this sort of scenario. It needs to be aware that it's uncertain. Microsoft also had this chat bot for Twitter that the environment drastically changed because people were manipulating it, and it totally moved away from the training environment and became, according to the media, a Hitler-loving sex robot within 24 hours. Seems impressive. And so some of the sources of uncertainty I'm talking about here are, it's important to distinguish. There's inherent uncertainty, which is this observation noise, which even if we collect more data, we're just not going to be able to get rid of it because of the issue, the quality of the sensors and the measurements being made are just limited. For example, if you're trying to predict someone's height based on their weight, there's many other factors at play. You're just not going to be able to predict it perfectly. This sort of uncertainty you can handle by modeling it appropriately. You can have a specific likelihood function that allows for that. You can have things like quantile regression or classification with abstention. These are all sort of frameworks to deal with this inherent uncertainty. But a more sort of insidious notion of uncertainty is this model uncertainty, where you have, even if you had chosen the right model, which you're obviously never sure of, you obviously can't specify the parameters just using finite data up to full accuracy. And so you're going to have to keep track of how uncertain you are, both over the parameters, if it's a parametric model, as well as the whether or not you're even using the right model. And the key here is that traditionally this uncertainty could be minimized in sequential design, sequential experimentation frameworks by collecting more data in places where you're uncertain. But if you just have a limited data set, we're going to have to confront this head on.
Is that the main thing that's going on in sequential things? They're reducing uncertainty?
Yeah, so there is, of course, an issue of confusing observation noise with model uncertainty and vice versa. And so you might collect data for a while thinking you're trying to reduce model uncertainty somewhere, but actually it's just observation noise. But people have ways of handling this. It's all mostly done through explicit modeling. And sort of, there's many options there. It's pretty well established, and so I'm not going to focus on that in this talk as much. And so, sort of one of the most popular methods in machine learning for handling uncertainty is this Gaussian process regression framework. And so here you assume sort of your outcomes y are some function of your features x plus some additive noise. And you assume this prior over the functions f, that they follow a Gaussian process, which is just some distribution over functions that is determined by a specific covariance kernel, which basically quantifies how similar two data points should be according to any sort of domain knowledge you have about the process. And so these enable very efficient inference of the posterior of the outcomes given the current features. And you can extend the vanilla Gaussian process framework to non-Gaussian outcomes, heteroscedasticity, missing data, deep neural network methods. Basically anything you can think of, there has been a Gaussian process method developed around that. So it's very extensible and very widely applicable. And so the first sort of setup I'm going to talk about is that we just have this fixed observational, possibly data set of features and outcomes. Again, denoted covariates or features will be denoted by x, and then the outcome will be denoted by y. And we're just going to assume everything is continuous valued for simplicity. And roughly speaking, the goal is just you're going to be given this data set, you can fit some models to it, and then at test time you're going to be asked, you're going to be given either new individuals and asked to influence them in some way to improve their outcomes, or you're going to be asked to improve the outcome over the whole population in some way. And so just very...
Should I be thinking here of the set where the latent features are uncorrelated with covariance? So I'm trying to think about what actually works, causality versus correlation.
Yeah, so I will get to that in 1 second, but we're not going to try and deal with the difficult causal situations.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be a relatively simple setup. So we're mainly focused on dealing with the model uncertainty as opposed to issues of causality here. So again, a motivating example, a very simple toy example would be, you can either influence people's caloric intake, the amount of exercise they do, and you're trying to have a weight loss program. And so, for this person, right here, you might tell them they should exercise this much more and reduce their caloric intake this much more. And it's a pretty safe sort of change to suggest because you have seen lots of data around that individual, and you've seen lots of data around where you think they will end up after your intervention. However, say you were given this individual who has like an extremely calorie deficient diet, it's probably not wise to sort of recommend to that person that they should restrict their calories even further, because it's very unclear what will happen. I mean, for humans it's unclear, but it's pretty clear. But for an automated system, just learning from this data, it would have no idea what would happen, and obviously there's many health risks associated with such a proposal. Likewise, if we were given some individual who is much higher weighing than anyone we've ever seen before, he's eating 3 times as much food as everyone we've ever seen before, it's not clear that you should recommend, for example, exercise for such an individual, because again, there's unknown health risks that might appear because you just are very uncertain as what the correct action would be for such a person. And so going back to the framework I mentioned, we're going to sort of assume away most of the nasty causality issues through some very strong statistical assumptions. So the first one is that we're just working here in applications where it's clear that our covariates or features are really causal of the outcomes, and we're not worried about like vice versa, the outcome might reverse cause the features. We're also crucially assuming that we can enact some transformation T of these covariate values such that after we do some external intervention, we can really realize that transformation, no matter what that transformation was. And we'll work within sort of limited families of transformations that sort of through domain knowledge, we know that we can actually arrive at some desired setting of the covariate values through an external intervention to match the transformation specified by T.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you said.
Sure. So you're going to have a transformation T. For example, going back to the previous example, T might say that we want to increase the amount of exercise for this individual and decrease the caloric intake by this much. And now we're going to assume that through external intervention, you can actually realize that change.
I see. So the design intervention is feasible.
Exactly. It's feasible. And precisely feasible.
So everything observed was an intervention, and every intervention that you want to achieve can be done.
It's like you have data
exactly.
on an RCT and you're trying to predict out-of-sample average treatment effects. It's that.
Yeah, it could be if you had explicit actions as one of your features.
Yeah.
But I don't get to try this and observe it. Is that what you're saying? Because I'm not doing this sequential thing.
You're right. You don't get to just try things out and see what happens. No. You're given the data, and you're never going to get any more data.
My job is to choose a T.
Yes, exactly. It's going to boil down to just finding the right T. And finally, the sort of crucial assumption here is that if we do some intervention, so x tilde here denotes sort of the values of the features after you've actually done some external intervention, that the underlying function that relates the variables to the outcomes doesn't change suddenly because of that external intervention. That's just a crucial thing that has to be assumed. And so the broad framework will be, your goal will be to find this desired transformation policy, and we're going to assume that we have some constrained set of feasible interventions that we can actually sort of precisely realize. And so some very common ones might be that you can only change certain features by a fixed amount at most, or that for a given individual, you can only tell them we're going to change these k features, because you can't overload someone with 100 changes that they should make in their life. And so the first step is going to be, we're going to try and do some inference of this underlying function that relates the features to the outcomes. And we're going to use this Gaussian process regression framework I alluded to before. And that posterior will just be summarized by a mean and a covariance function. And then once we've got the posterior, roughly speaking, the strategy will be to optimize this transformation T with respect to this posterior while trying to sort of remain within this constraint set. And so when we're doing this optimization, we have to come up with an objective function. And that's what I'm going to sort of get into here, what we actually think is the optimal intervention, what is the best one. Given the fact that we actually have uncertainty, we sort of have to incorporate this into our objective. And so here we're going to be given a new individual with covariate values x, and we're going to personally tailor an intervention for this individual. And that's just going to be t of x. So we can just imagine we're just optimizing a new vector, t of x, which is saying where do we want this individual to end up. We don't even have to worry about t being a transformation in and of itself. And so we're going to think of this expected gain function for this individual, which is basically saying how much do we expect the post-intervention outcome at t of x to have improved or changed as opposed to before we had done anything. So it's just the difference of the expected outcome after enacting t versus before. And so this is a random quantity, this expected individual gain, because we're being Bayesian here. And so under this Bayesian notion, we can look at the quantiles of this random quantity. And what we're going to define as our actual objective function to optimize with respect to the transformation is going to be a low quantile. So think of alpha as like 0.05 or something. We're going to look at a low quantile of this expected gain over this posterior distribution for this expected gain, and we're going to try and optimize that. So we're going to say the best intervention is the one that with high probability, according to our posterior beliefs, will improve the expected outcome by a large amount. And again, expected outcome here because we're not worried about observation noise and sort of inherent stochasticity in this framework, but you can easily incorporate those again by including terms into your model.
There's no averaging here. This is going to be pointwise and X. So I'm going to
Pointwise
find the right thing.
Right, for each individual. And so going back to the previous example where you had the one individual with huge caloric intake who looked very different than anybody else, ideally you want to return T just being the identity because you have no real idea what to do for that individual. And yeah, so we'll actually see that in a second. So basically the posterior for this gain function, again, we have a posterior for our individual f given by the Gaussian process regression framework. And so the posterior for this gain function is very simply expressed in terms of just these variance terms, these mean terms, and this covariance term, which ties the uncertainty we have about the underlying relationship at x and t of x. So this is crucially sort of what makes this different than, there's a lot of work on like Bayesian optimization with like upper confidence bound algorithms. And you can imagine just transforming all of that into lower confidence bound style methods, which are sort of pessimistic and conservative, just like this framework. But the problem is there's no uncertainty tied between the pre-intervention and the post-intervention if you're doing a method like that. And so that's a sort of crucial, subtle difference just to be aware of. And so the interpretation is that, again, this T star, after we do this optimization, will improve our expected outcome with high probability according to the posterior beliefs, and it's going to improve it by this amount that we see in our objective, however much optimization we were able to do. And crucially, if we choose the choice T of x equals x, then the gain, the change is going to be 0, right? And so you're never going to consider sort of negative objective values here. And so you're never going to consider any transformation that in expected value would be bad, right? Which obviously, a naive thing a lot of people currently are already doing is they're just fitting some predictive function of outcomes given features using some machine learning model, and then they're just optimizing the predictions of that model without any notions of uncertainty. So this at least wouldn't differ from that in terms of making you worse in any way. So in expected value, you're always going to do better. And likewise, if you have high uncertainty at any given particular individual, you're always just going to recommend doing no intervention because the uncertainty is going to make this objective start to take negative values as soon as you propose any intervention. And so that was sort of these personally tailored, personalized interventions. Now we're going to consider using just a single policy to transform an entire population. And so here you have to actually think about what the model for the underlying population was, and sort of, because you're given this pre-intervention population and you're going to enact some transformation policy and change it to a post-intervention population. And so you really have to be aware of what the pre-intervention population looked like and take that into consideration. And so here we can define this expected population gain, which is just saying the expectation over all individuals of how much their outcomes would improve with respect to a particular transformation. And it's obvious that you can just easily replace that with an empirical estimate and sort of circumvent having to specify a complicated model of this population just by taking the sample average over the population. And so again, as you might have guessed, the optimal population intervention under this framework will just be to maximize this a low quantile of this expected population gain, actually the empirical version of that.
So there might be some people that are causing real harm by taking first the average and then the distribution of the...
Yeah.
Take the average of the quantiles if you want it sort of like conditional on that. So it could be that there is some X here that you're really causing a lot of harm.
Yeah, it is definitely.
As opposed to doing the average of the low of the 25% quantiles or something.
Well, I think it's more due to averaging. So even if you average the quantiles, you can still have harm for specific So if you don't want to harm individuals, I think you have to use a robust, like a median style or a quantile over the population, which of course definitely you could do. Yeah, here we're thinking more about of if you imagine, for example, cell populations or certain domains where your overall outcome is measured as an average over things, then average is probably the right way to go.
So now that property you were saying of the guy that we know nothing about, we do nothing on, no longer holds. We could
Exactly.
do something.
Right. And the key here is that we're going to have to enact a single sort of transformation policy on everybody. And so we're no longer just able to optimize over T of X as if it was just a vector of where we want to end up. We actually have to consider what kind of transformation we're looking at and optimize within that class.
These two things, like with respect to say practical
Yep.
drug intervention, it feels like if I have a lot of data, I can do the first one. But if I've got a small amount of data, I have to do this because otherwise I'm going to end up taking zero action
For everybody, yeah, that is certainly possible. But you can kind of hack around that through the Gaussian process framework of choosing hyperparameters of like how much uncertainty you want to. Yeah.
Prior that it's going to work.
Yeah, you always have. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so the posterior again will have some closed form, and so we can do the optimization relatively easily. So here again, the form of T cannot depend on X because in many applications you might not even measure features anymore in the future. For example, in many medical applications, anything in sort of biology, you've collected this data for some cell population, but at test time you just want to apply some chemicals to new cells. You're not going to want to keep measuring the say, gene expression within the cells anymore. And so here we're going to consider, again, just some fixed classes of intervention. So one is just going to be this shift intervention where we just add some vector to everybody's values. Another really simple one would be that you just fix certain variables to fixed values across the entire population. We call that covariate fixing. And so these are sort of very trivial, broad classes of interventions we think would be useful in many applications. And also, we often are worried about sort of sparse interventions that only affect a small subset of the variables. And again, crucially, we're assuming always that everything else that we didn't intervene on remains actually fixed at where it was before, which may or may not be true in practice. And so just a simple example of some of these kinds of interventions that I'm talking about. If we have a two-dimensional feature space here, x1, x2, and the outcome, say, is just the product, so we're showing the level sets of the expected outcomes. The black might be the original population. The red shows that population after a shift intervention on that second variable. The green dots of the two different colors show these covariate fixing interventions where I just fixed one of the variables to a fixed value. It shows what the population would look like. And then the highlighted dots with the arrows are showing, individual interventions, personally tailored interventions. You might have different interventions that are good for different people or on different variables if you have a sparsity constraint even.
Yeah, nice other question.
Yeah.
How do you do the shift intervention if you don't measure the features?
So in practice, it would be like you would be assuming that you're going to add some chemical to your cell population, or you're going to, given a person, you're going to tell them you should be making this change in your life, which doesn't actually require having knowledge of the pre-measurements, right?
Okay.
The initial measurements don't matter if you just say you want to change whatever you were doing by this amount.
It's like everybody should eat no carbs, right?
Exactly.
And it's like that. You don't need to know how many carbs people are eating.
Well, more carbs is different from shift. That's more
Yeah,
what
that's
I'm
the
saying.
that's the
You should eat
fixing.
5 fewer.
Oh,
Yeah.
you're right. You're right.
But you can't say you should eat 20% fewer carbs.
Right.
I'm confused about
No,
what
so
the carb
you-
rules
You
are.
could
Yeah.
redefine
You
that.
could definitely redefine it to do that.
Be logs.
Exactly. Yeah, so there's obviously many other classes of
What does it
interventions.
mean to say that you're not looking at the x's?
What does it mean?
In order to implement, reduce your carb intake by 20%, you need to know what your current carb intake is.
Right, but the individual might know that, and
You
it's
don't
not
need to
revealed to the prescriber, the policy maker.
But I guess what Butler's saying is that
Confused.
there's always some transformation. Like, how can you actually define the difference between a shift and just like a full mapping that moves people who are at a current value to some other value? Because by a suitable change of variables,
It depends on the x's you observed.
Right, if your change of variables had occurred in the training data as well, that's okay.
well, no, but you said you could redefine the variables so that a 20% reduction would be an admissible shift intervention, right? but then there would be some other nonlinear transformation that would do some other version of that. And so eventually, isn't that what you're saying? But you can get essentially any mapping
monotonic
from, well, maybe you can even do one. I mean, I don't know.
If you transform your data itself before learning the mapping, I don't think you can get any mapping, but
you can get a lot of things.
Could you just hand the function to the individual and say, apply this function to...
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the full generality version of this, yeah.
Okay.
But then you have to optimize a function, and presumably you would want to parameterize it in some way. Then all of this methodology would work. But if you have other classes of functions, we're not doing like variational calculus or anything here, optimizing the functions. We're just going to optimize with the parameters. So that's why in the shift case, you have the parameters are the vectors of shifts. In the covariant fixing case, you just have the parameters that are what you're going to set the values, the variables to throughout the population. And so yeah, again, going back to what I said before, this low quantile of the gain functions in both the population and personalized case has just a closed form. And so if you use a smooth kernel inside your Gaussian process prior, then every objective is just differentiable with respect to this transformation. And so you can use gradient methods, is what I'm alluding to. But if altering a specific variable has a cost associated by how much you alter it, it's also very easy to encode, obviously, just using a penalty. And likewise, we're going to use the same L1 style penalty to actually find sparse interventions, which can solve the convex relaxation there. And so, yeah, we're just going to do projected gradient ascent to actually optimize our transformations within this constraint set of feasible interventions. And one issue here is that we have tons of really poor local maxima, because this objective function is a low quantile of these gain functions, and what Gaussian processes do is between sort of every data points, as you interpolate between them, there's sort of like a little bump in uncertainty. And so you have tons of these little local optima that don't really matter much. They're not, like if you looked at it from far away, the function, you would not see them. But at a local level, if you're just following first order information, these local optima are really going to screw you over. And so we have a strategy where we use this continuation technique to optimize a smooth variant of the objective, and then gradually reduce the amount of smoothing so that the more fine-grained structure in the function emerges as you do the gradient-based optimization. But essentially, you're not going to be stuck at one of these little local optima. And this is known as homotopy or continuation in math. And in the Gaussian process framework, it's actually really easy to do, because you already have this kernel function, and typically you have some bandwidth or some parameter that controls the smoothness of the kernel function. And so you can just exaggerate the smoothness by using a much smoother kernel, and then gradually temper that down to the actual kernel you wanted to use. And so we just derived some simple theory about this sort of framework. One is that because of this posterior contraction, that if you find the true maximizer of these personalized or empirical population intervention objectives, that it's actually going to approach the optimal transformation with respect to the true underlying function that relates the features to the outcomes, regardless of what that true underlying function is. And the convergence rate will basically depend on the distance between that true function and your prior distribution over functions. So you have to have non-zero probability for the true function. So here, this is technically for like smooth functions. But as long as that function has non-zero probability under your prior, basically there's going to be this quantity that measures how much probability is assigned to this true function by your prior, and you'll have a convergence rate that depends on that.
And this is an expectation over your prior.
Expectation over the data. These are all going to be frequentist results, not Bayesian results. Yeah. So this is like a different viewpoint on this framework. And also, that was sort of saying that as you have huge samples, you're going to do well in expectation, as well as the optimal transformation with respect to the real function. And for finite samples, basically we show that if your true underlying function lies within the reproducing kernel Hilbert space of this Gaussian process prior that you chose, meaning it's sort of spanned by, you chose the proper kernel here, then your chosen intervention that you get after the optimization at any sample size is highly unlikely to be harmful, where the probability decreases exponentially sort of with your choice of this parameter alpha, which was saying how conservative you are, how low of a quantile are you optimizing.
you explain that one a little bit? So I'm targeting I don't know, 5% probability of going wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I have finite data, so am I doing worse than that? Am I actually getting it right on? I mean, I must be getting worse with some probabilities.
Yeah, so the statement here is that the actual outcome change that will result from doing this optimization and enacting the transformation won't be negative. You won't have found a bad intervention with overwhelming probability at any
How does that relate to 5%?
So it will be controlled by this alpha, which I'm saying we're setting at 5% for now.
Okay.
So the probability that something bad happens.
What also be controlled by? Yeah, I guess I would just ask you to unpack that expression a little bit.
Yeah, so it's obviously not going to be exactly 5%
right,
because we're not in the Bayesian framework here. In the Bayesian framework, it would be exactly 5% because you would be assuming the model was totally true and according to your posterior distribution, everything would, according to that formalism, it would be 5% probability that things actually were worse than you thought they were. But this is a frequentist result, saying we fix the underlying function first, we have a finite sample size, and this is a probability over the data and the noise in the data, not a posterior belief here. So these are not random variables, except for the t store. Okay, so just some example applications that we tried out. So one is we had a population of yeast where the expression levels of 10 different transcription factor genes were measured, as well as the expression of many downstream small molecule metabolism genes. And so there was actually 16 of these, and so we just took each one of these 16 as a separate outcome. So we have sort of 16 different tasks. And the task we formulated was that you were supposed to propose a single transcription factor to knock out. So this uniform covariate fixing intervention where you just set it to 0. And you're supposed to downregulate the resulting metabolism gene the most. And so here we compare it against sort of the standard statistical approach, which is to fit a regression model, find what's statistically significant, which of the genes have statistically significant effect sizes. Out of those statistically significant effect sizes, just choose the one with the biggest effect size, and that's the one you choose for your intervention. And so they have additional data that's non-observational where they actually tried knocking out each one of these 16 or each one of these 10 transcription factors and saw what happened. And so we can actually evaluate these single transcription factor knockdowns and see the effect of any proposed knockdown. And so each of these curves is showing the actual effect that resulted from knocking down the specific transcription factor chosen by a particular method for each of the tasks. So each of these is one of the downstream genes. So the horizontal axis is just showing different tasks. The gray line is showing if we actually had chosen the best transcription factor, how much downregulation could we have seen. And so you can see that none of the methods are able to really get close to this optimum across all these genes. It's a super noisy data set. But you can see that this Gaussian process population intervention framework is able to propose good interventions for many genes, whereas these regression frameworks propose many more harmful interventions and really have no effect at all. And you can sort of see, zooming in a little bit, for example here, this multivariate linear regression framework found a very harmful intervention that actually led to upregulation when it was knocked down, when this transcription factor was knocked down. And you can see the reason it sort of found that was because you have just very few sort of high influence points, and that in an uncertainty framework, the uncertainty around those points would be very high, but in a statistical significance framework, you just, all that matters is the slope of the regression line. If you're not doing proper diagnostics and things like that, yeah, you can end up with an effect size that's totally determined based on outliers.
So in this case, you'd expect that somebody would look at the statistical significance and say, I don't want to do that. Did people based on this have an idea of what they would propose as an actual policy?
Oh, so if none of the variables were statistically significant in the regression, then you would have proposed no.
So you're beating that even.
Yeah, it would have been 0. So you see a lot of zeros, right? For all the methods. Yeah. Sometimes, yeah, nothing is significant. So another application we consider is we have a bunch of news articles taken from this website Mashable, and so Mashable keeps track of sort of shares on the internet, And so for each news article, we can see how popular it ended up being. And we have a bunch of NLP features of the news articles. So here we're not considering the raw text, but we're considering features like word counts, polarity, subjectivity, alignment with different topics on a topic model, number of images, things like that in the article, length of the title, and things like that. And so here we just compare our method using this low quantile, so very conservative, like 5% quantile, saying we very rarely want to do harmful interventions, with sort of the standard thing you would do, which would be to just ignore uncertainty totally. This is what a lot of people, again, are doing, that you just have a predictive model and you just optimize with respect to your predictive model and get some proposed changes. And that's, in this Gaussian process framework, exactly equivalent to just choosing alpha being 0.5 if we use a Gaussian output, Gaussian likelihood function.
So what's the benchmark here that you use to evaluate the quality of this? Do they actually do an experiment with this? Or?
Yeah, so here we can't evaluate because we have no
when you say
ability to write a new article. Yeah, so the way we evaluate it is we have a held out set of articles, and then when we propose an intervention, we look at if there's a very near neighbor to that proposed intervention. So these articles are represented in a very reduced space, right, of just, I think there was like 40 or 50 features for each article. And so we look, is there articles within some nearest neighbor of this article that or of this new set of features that we want to be at. And if there's many articles within a small ball around there, then we just evaluate the average popularity that resulted of those, kind of like a matching framework as you would do in traditional causal inference. If that makes sense.
I think so.
So we're saying you've proposed this intervention for the features, right? So here we're doing personalized intervention. Given an article's features, propose a change to the features to improve that article's popularity. So you've now proposed some change. You're at a new setting of the features. You look for that new setting of the features. Is there any held out data near there, very close to there? And if there's a lot of articles that are close to there, then we say we can actually evaluate this intervention.
So under the
So
assumption that these features are valid because the held out sample reveals the causal effects.
Right.
I see.
Yeah, of course, it's a very coarse approximation to the text of the article would obviously be actually very different.
Right.
Maybe I'm confused, but suppose that you had perfect matches in the held out data.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you get exactly what your model says you should get? So that is to say, you would get harmed less often, but you would do better on average.
Yeah, that's kind of obvious.
But you're not getting that, right? You're getting doesn't do as badly, doesn't hurt averages and avoids harm. So it's you're doing strictly better.
Right.
But I call it why that's obviously going to happen. Why
the idea is you're just not sacrificing that much for this.
which is awesome, but how? maybe it's just
So
it's
also heavily constrained is the thing.
Okay.
And also, so if you're optimizing a predictive function, your held out data might not still exactly lie in only high density regions, so you can still not necessarily do better, right?
Okay.
So something interesting we looked at is if we look at, so we actually are doing sparse interventions here. I think we're intervening on 5 of the features. And so something funny to look at is if you look at articles in the business category, the transformations suggested for those are always advocating decreasing the polarity of the article. And this is actually something very intuitive because you see for many news articles that are popular about business, it's always this business is tanking, the CEO had some scandal. It's almost never, the popular ones are almost never that this company is, business as usual or doing well. And likewise, in the entertainment category, something actually really interesting is that this framework often proposes interventions to decrease the subjectivity of the titles. And you also find this intuitively because many of these entertainment articles are about like 5 things you can do to have a more healthy summer, and they're written in very scientific language, very objective seeming language, even though they're obviously somebody's total opinion piece, but they're written in very strong, very rigorous language that makes it seem like almost like a research paper.
So did you code behind all of the clickbaits?
No, this is not in production.
Is that running?
Yes, but it could be used for this. So. It's not my goal in life. So finally, we investigate these methods in a really causal setting where everything is horribly misspecified. And so we have we have these underlying data sets drawn from structured equation models, which are causal, directed acyclic graphs, where sort of one feature or variable causes other variables, and so on and so forth, until the outcome we always assume is a sync node in the graph. So all the variables cause the outcome, but they can also cause each other. And now if I choose to intervene on only some of the variables, my intervention will actually propagate to the other variables in an unforeseen way according to this do calculus that's used in the structured equation model framework. Whereas our framework is just assuming whatever you thought was going to happen according to T actually took place post-intervention. And so what we're going to do is we're going to generate data from a non-linear or non-Gaussian linear structured equation model, which is sort of really badly specified for the Gaussian process framework because we're just using Gaussian likelihoods. Nothing is tailored. We're using like a automatic relevance determination kernel. Nothing is tailored to this setting at all. Likewise, again, when we actually enact an intervention, it's enacted according to this do calculus. And so the competitor method we're comparing against here is that you first estimate the structured equation model within that model family, where you actually had prescribed the correct model family. And then within the estimated structured equation model, you can just read out what would have been the best intervention to do because it's a linear structured equation model. And here we're just focusing on this covariate fixing intervention, again, where you, over the population, where you just set a single covariate to a fixed value. And you can show a theorem that basically roughly says that if none of the parents of your outcome, the immediate parents, is a descendant of other immediate parents of the outcome, then this approach will always work well. And it's pretty obvious. It's just saying if you can sort of target all the immediate causes, this framework will always target those immediate causes, because basically the mutual information or total correlation between those and the outcomes will obviously be much higher. And so here's the experimental result. So we have these two different structured equation models where we always take the sync node to be the outcome variable. And these were actually just graphs chosen by the authors of this linear non-Gaussian modeling structured equation model estimation work, this Lingham method. And basically, again, you just infer the structured equation model using this inference strategy that they proposed. And then you find what would be the best do operation within the inferred structured equation model. Then you actually evaluate that do operation within the true structured equation model. Our method proposes a single covariate fixing covariate fixing transformation for one of the variables. And again, you just evaluate that as a do operation in the true underlying structured equation model. And so in black is showing the actual outcome improvement in expectation that you could achieve if you had really chosen the best variable all the time. And sort of, you can see at low sample sizes, the methods are roughly equivalent, but our method clearly, even in this super misspecified setting, is able to outperform the Lingham method that knows the exact model class perfectly and has everything sort of working out perfectly for it. And it's because simply that it's trying to estimate everything, and it's a much harder estimation problem to estimate this whole structured equation model than just the immediate causes of the outcomes and the precise functional relationships.
So if I understand what you said before, in the right, is this an example of where one of the parents of Y is a descendant of
right? So these are
Y?
not
So
from our theorem.
Okay.
Yeah. These are just
works well even without.
Right. These are just the two graphs that the authors in that work had used to present their method, essentially. So yeah, so this more philosophically, sort of this do calculus structured equation modeling framework is also not necessarily always appropriate, because what really matters fundamentally at the end of the day is how these external interventions are realized and how you've actually represented your data on a finite set of features. So for example, if you're modeling documents and you have features like polarity and word count, and you're trying to increase the text's polarity, that's what the desired change is. One way I could do that is I could insert a bunch of positive adjectives, right? And that would also inadvertently increase the word count. But that had nothing really to do with this do calculus propagation. That was purely a function of how I did this external intervention. And likewise, I could instead, just replace certain words with more positive alternatives, and that would fit perfectly within our framework, right? Which is assuming that word count was not going to change, and just polarity was going to change. And so, yeah, we think this is an additional sort of toolkit that in settings where you really have a lot of control over how you externally intervene in a way that can mitigate these off-target effects, that this could be a useful thing to do. And now I'm going to switch gears a little bit to structured data. So before we were considering continuous data, we were doing these interventions in the data space, and we were doing gradient-based continuous optimization to find the desired transformations of each data point. So here we're going to consider sequence data specifically, where we have a sequence denoted by X of some symbols from some discrete vocabulary. And again, roughly speaking, we're going to have outcomes associated with each sequence, and our goal is going to be to change the sequences in some way to improve the outcomes, just like before. The key thing to note here is that typically you'll have a tiny fraction of the space of all possible sequences that actually represent sequences that are realistic or likely to occur. For example, if you're modeling sentences, a random list of words is never going to be like a readable, grammatically valid sentence. And so some examples of data that fit within this framework might be, again, you could have social media comments and popularity, their subsequent popularity, or you could have an antibody sequence, the amino acid sequence of an antibody protein, and how well that specific antibody actually targets a particular antigen. And so again, we just have this data set of sequence outcome pairs, just a fixed data set. We're going to have inherent uncertainty. And the key here is we have this generative model of these natural sequences that are highly sparse within the set of all possible sequences. And we're going to be assuming that at test time we're given a new sequence x0, and we're just going to be asked to find a revised version x star that has superior expected outcome. And here the formalism is a little different. We're not going to optimize a low quantile, but rather we're going to want to assume that we optimize within this set of sequences that all are natural. And I will get to that in a second, what I mean by a natural sequence. So some goals of this revision procedure for changing a particular sequence are that it produces natural sequences, preserves intrinsic similarity, improves the outcomes, obviously, and is computationally efficient. And mathematically, we address these topics within our generative modeling framework by saying the probability of the revised sequence under this model should not be too low. If we have latent variables within our model, X, the revised sequence and the original should have similar values on these latent variables. Obviously, the outcome improvement, again, is just this conditional expectation being positive. And computational efficiency will be ensured by, again, using gradient-based tools instead of combinatorial genetic programming style optimization. And so here, just like before, we're not going to have improved versions of any sequences in the training data. There's no human supervision. So we're not doing imitation learning. We're not doing reinforcement learning. We're not allowed to try out things and just see what happened. And so we just, again, have this fixed data set, and we need to learn sort of a revision policy that is able to produce better sequences. And so the main idea is going to be to actually turn this combinatorial optimization into a differentiable continuous optimization problem by leveraging sort of latent representations learned within neural networks. And so the underlying generative model we assume is that we have some latent variable z that are going to be generating both sequences x and the outcomes y. And these latent variables will typically be fairly low dimensional, maybe 50, 100 dimensional, where the sequences could be length 30, 40 with a vocabulary of thousands. And so we're going to have a prior distribution on this latent space that's somewhat arbitrary, say just a Gaussian. And we're going to have inference maps that sort of do approximate inference that are parameterized by neural networks. So we're going to have a map F that tries to infer the outcomes based on the latent variables. There's going to be a map D that tries to infer the sequences based on the latent variables. And we're going to have an inference map E that tries to infer the latent variable values given a particular sequence. And once we've learned this generative model and all these inference maps, the way we're going to do revising is we're just going to first infer what are the latent variables associated with this initial sequence. And we're going to predict the outcome using our outcome prediction neural network. And then we start taking gradient steps within the latent space with respect to the outcome predictions until we sort of hit an optimum latent configuration. And then finally, we're going to decode, we're going to ask what's the most likely sequence to have been associated with this value of the latent variables. And that's going to be our proposed revision. And key to our revision procedure is we're actually going to constrain this optimization, this gradient optimization in this latent space will be constrained in a very particular way so that we can actually ensure that this decoded X star, this revised sequence, will actually look like a realistic sequence and will have non-negligible probability under this distribution from which our training data came. And so we're going to just use a variational autoencoder framework to learn this generative model. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty here, but basically we have recurrent neural networks that generate both sequences from the latent variables, as well as encode what's the posterior distribution over latent variables given a particular sequence. And we're just going to learn these using the traditional stochastic variational inference technique for variational autoencoders. And here we're using GRU, recurrent neural networks. And so we're going to define, again, these neural network inference maps. The encoder E of x is going to be the most likely values of the latent variables given a particular sequence. And the decoder neural network is going to try and, or the decoder map is going to try and return the most likely sequence given a setting of the latent variables. And jointly with the variational autoencoder, we're going to train an outcome prediction map that tries to predict the outcomes given the latent variable values. And we're going to jointly train this. This is just a simple standard feed-forward neural network. And we're going to train it jointly just using a mean squared error loss with the variational autoencoder framework. However, one problem that can arise within what I've described so far is we could learn a latent representation Z that's sort of split into two blocks, where the first block is actually used for producing sequences based on latent variables, and the second block is used for predicting outcomes. And so actually once we're changing the latent variables, we're actually only changing the second block, because that's all that the outcome prediction depended on, whereas the first block is what's going to actually generate a revised sequence, and so nothing will change, even though we thought we were changing a lot. And this is a problem basically because we have too big of a latent space. So it can be addressed in a somewhat heuristic way by really bottlenecking your latent dimensionality to force all the information to be sort of shared across each latent variable. But in addition, we actually include an invariance term that says essentially that the outcome predictions should be invariant to encoding decoding variation, meaning that any sort of encoding decoding change that happens, sort of the outcome variation is orthogonal to that direction. And this can also be trained, again, jointly with all the other components that I mentioned. And so, yeah, roughly speaking, we're training all these things together, some weighted combination of the variational autoencoder loss, the outcome predictions, and this invariance loss. And once we've trained the model, we want to produce revisions. And again, if you recall the procedure, it was we were going to use our encoder network to produce a posterior distribution over what latent variables could have generated the sequence, which are the believable settings of the latent variables. Then what we're actually going to do is we're going to define a constraint set that is the high probability, the level set of that posterior distribution, meaning these are all of the latent variables that were above some probability, according to our posterior belief, to have generated this sequence. And within that constraint set, we're just going to do gradient-based optimization of the latent variables with respect to the predicted outcomes to land at a setting of the latent variable Z star that's still believable to have generated our initial sequence, but it's also associated with a much greater outcome. And then finally, again, we try and find the most likely sequence to have been generated by that setting of the latent variables, and that is the whole revision procedure. And so if the neural network approximations are all perfectly exact, then sort of all our desires will be perfectly satisfied. Obviously, it's really hard to say anything about when neural network training will work, will not work. And so we just sort of look at if each neural network was trained on some objective, and if it was successful in getting within some accuracy of that objective with respect to the underlying distribution, then what's the effect of that on this overall revision procedure? And so basically, what you can show is that if you assume sort of your variational approximation here is sort of close to the true posteriors, then you can show that this revised sequence will have non-negligible probability, which will depend on this likelihood of the initial sequence. Obviously, if we're given an initial sequence that lies very far away from all the other sentences we've ever seen before, we're not going to be able to revise it in a meaningful way. So it depends on that, and it also depends on this parameter alpha, which, like in the original framework, is sort of a notion of how conservative you are. It's saying within this posterior distribution, how big of a set in the latent space are we going to optimize over? And then the next result is just saying that if we additionally assume that our outcome predicting neural network predicts the conditional outcomes with some accuracy epsilon, then outcomes of the revised sequences will also be good with some factor controlled by epsilon. And so here we applied this to some data of sentences taken from beer reviews, and we have a sentiment score of each sentence, where the sentiment score was actually extracted using this Vader NLP algorithm, so we can actually apply it to new revised sentences and really see how well our proposed revisions did. But again, none of the model has any knowledge of this algorithm. We're essentially learning the algorithm from scratch. And so here you can see that using a very conservative value of alpha, we end up with the highest likelihood of these revised sequences, where we trained a language model on a huge held out set of sentences from the same data set to get likelihoods for each sequence. Likewise, if we allow ourselves to do a little more optimization in the latent space, then we're actually able to produce better expected outcomes, but we sacrifice, we produce slightly less realistic looking new sentences. And we compare against a totally non-probabilistic version of this framework, where you have no variational autoencoder. It's just a standard autoencoder and outcome prediction module, and you just do some fixed number of gradient steps. And that just doesn't do nearly as well. And we also compare with a random search strategy, where you just kind of mutate your given sentence with respect to some predictive model of the outcomes and try and score each sort of mutation. And so just some examples of revisions produced by the different methods. Here we're trying to improve the sentiment of any given input sentence, shown in bold. And you can sort of see that it does produce pretty realistic things for these examples that seem pretty readable. Finally, a fun example we just tried was given a corpus of data not written by Shakespeare, just modern day text, and a corpus of data taken by Shakespeare. We want to revise it so that so we give the Shakespeare data a high label, the regular data a low label, and we just want to improve the outcome so that the author looks more like Shakespeare. And here we're just showing, we take some fixed number of gradient steps, 100, 1,000, 5,000, from this initial sequence in the latent space, and then we just keep decoding. And the rough thing you can see is that as you take more and more gradient steps, eventually you just get somewhere that looks super unrealistic. And this X star here is, again, the output that would have been produced within this constraint set that I described, using this constrained gradient optimization. And so, roughly, it produces some funny results, but roughly we think this thing does produce mostly natural sequences, it does improve the outcomes, it is efficient. One thing it's still not doing that well is in preserving the intrinsic semantics between the data, between the sentences, especially in this Shakespeare example, presumably just because we never have a very similar sentence in both corpuses. And so some other work I've done is sort of learning similarity between sentences, fundamental human semantic similarities, and that's another topic I'm really interested in. That's all. Oh, and I'm also using this for antibody design, but I won't get into that.